The gavel hadn't even finished its second strike when he pointed at me and said the words that would end his career. "Take that filthy jacket off. This courtroom deserves respect." I stood there in a room full of strangers, 30 hours without sleep, still burning behind my eyes, and I said the only thing I could say. "I'm sorry, Your Honor, I can't." I watched his face go from irritation to fury in under 2 seconds. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that a 4-star Admiral was walking down the hallway outside, and he was about to hear 2 words that would change everything. Ghost 4. The gavel hadn't even finished its second strike when he pointed at me and said the words that would end his career. "Take that filthy jacket off. This courtroom deserves respect." I stood there in a room full of strangers, 30 hours without sleep, still burning behind my eyes, and I said the only thing I could say. "I'm sorry, Your Honor, I can't." I watched his face go from irritation to fury in under 2 seconds. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that a 4-star Admiral was walking down the hallway outside, and he was about to hear 2 words that would change everything. Ghost 4. I didn't grow up thinking I'd end up in rooms like that. I grew up in a small town outside Lubbock, Texas, in a house where my father worked the oil fields, and my mother kept 3 jobs stitched together to make sure the lights stayed on. Nobody in my family had ever worn a uniform except my grandfather, and he never talked about what he'd seen in Korea, not once, not even when my grandmother begged him to on his worst nights. I think some part of me learned silence from him before I ever understood why silence mattered. I joined the Army at 19 because I wanted to be a nurse, and the Army was going to pay for the school my family couldn't afford. That's the honest reason. There was no grand speech in my head about duty and country, not at the beginning. I just wanted to learn how to take care of people, and somebody was willing to teach me if I gave them 4 years in return. I gave them a lot more than 4 years. Combat medic training changes something in you that doesn't change back. They teach you to move toward the sound of screaming, when every instinct in your body is built to move away from it. They teach you to keep your hands steady, while a man's blood is running warm over your fingers, and his eyes are searching your face for permission to stop fighting. I was good at it. I don't say that with pride exactly, I say it the way you'd describe any fact about yourself, like the color of your eyes. I was good at staying calm when nothing else in the world was calm, and somewhere along the way that got noticed by people who needed exactly that kind of steadiness for the kind of missions that don't get written down anywhere. I volunteered for deployments other medics tried to avoid. Not because I was fearless, anyone who tells you they weren't afraid is lying to you or to themselves, but because I'd already decided a long time ago that if someone was going to bleed out in some forgotten corner of the world, I wanted to be the one standing there with my hands ready. That decision took me places I've never talked about with anyone outside a very small circle of people who were there with me. Not my parents, not my closest friends, not the men and women I work beside every day at Walter Reed who know me as the quiet major who never talks about her past and never explains the old jacket she keeps in her locker, instead of the newer regulation one issued to her years ago. They notice things, of course. People always do. They notice that I flinch just slightly at the sound of a door slamming too hard. They notice that I check the exits in every room I walk into, a habit I picked up so long ago I don't even register I'm doing it anymore. They notice that when someone asks about my deployments, I give them 2 sentences and change the subject, and eventually people stop asking which is exactly what I want. The only person who ever really knew the full shape of what happened to me over there was my old commanding officer, and he's the kind of man who understands that some stories aren't his to tell either. That morning before the courtroom, before the jacket, before any of it, I was thinking about none of that. I was thinking about a young man named Ethan Brooks, a former Marine I'd never met until the week before, who was sitting at the defense table looking like a man who already understood the world, had decided to crush him, and was just waiting to see how long it would take. Ethan had done something that should have made him a hero. During a shooting at a grocery store outside the city when most people were running for the doors, he'd gone the other way toward a 9-year-old girl frozen behind a checkout counter, and he'd carried her out through a side exit while gunfire was still echoing through the aisles. By any measure that mattered, he'd saved her life. But somewhere between that parking lot and this courtroom, the story had been twisted into something else entirely, a lawsuit brought by a wealthy local businessman who claimed Ethan's actions during the chaos had caused property damage and endangered other customers, dressed up with enough legal language to make it sound almost reasonable if you didn't look too closely. I looked closely. That was my job that day, and I'd looked closely enough to know that something about the case didn't add up. Security footage that should have shown the full sequence of events had gaps in it, conveniently placed gaps right where Ethan's actions would have made the businessman's claims fall apart. A police report that described the timeline in a way that didn't match what I'd learned from Ethan himself during the one conversation we'd had before this trial. I wasn't there that day at the grocery store, but I'd spent the last several nights going through records most people wouldn't think to request, because once you've learned to read a battlefield, you start noticing when a story has been edited into something it never actually was. I was the only witness willing to say any of that out loud in front of a judge, which is exactly why I was standing in that courtroom in a jacket nobody wanted me to wear, waiting for a chance to speak the truth before it got buried under the weight of somebody else's money and somebody else's version of what happened. I didn't know yet that a 4-star Admiral had just frozen in the aisle behind me at the sound of 2 words. I only knew that I had a job to do, and I intended to do it, jacket and all. I didn't turn around right away. 10 years of training does that to you. It teaches you to finish what you started before you let yourself react to anything else in the room. Judge Hawthorne was still staring past me, his mouth slightly open around whatever sentence he'd been about to finish, and I could feel the entire courtroom holding its breath in that particular way a room does when everyone senses something is happening that they don't understand yet. "Did you just say—" The voice came from behind me, low, careful, like a man testing whether the ground beneath him was solid. "Ghost 4. I turned around then. The Admiral standing in the aisle was maybe in his late 50s, built the way men get built after 30 years of not letting their bodies go soft, even as everything else about them ages. 4 silver stars on his shoulder boards. A face I didn't recognize at first, not directly, but something in the way he held himself hit a memory in me that I'd buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself it had stopped existing. He wasn't looking at Judge Hawthorne. He wasn't looking at anyone else in that room. He was looking directly at the patch on my shoulder, the faded 4 letters and the number beneath them, and his face had gone the color of paper. "Yes, sir," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected, though something in my chest had started pounding hard enough that I was sure people could see it through my uniform. "That's my call sign." For a moment neither of us moved. I want to try to describe what that silence felt like, because it wasn't empty. It was full the way the air gets full right before a storm breaks thick with everything neither of us was saying yet. I hadn't heard that name spoken out loud by anyone outside a very small circle in almost a decade. I'd buried it so deep in my own life that hearing it now in a county courthouse of all places felt like watching a door I'd nailed shut years ago swing open on its own. Then the Admiral did something I will remember for the rest of my life. He walked past the bench, past the bailiff, past Judge Hawthorne himself, close enough that I could see the exact moment recognition fully landed in his eyes. Not just the patch, but me, the whole shape of who I was underneath it. And Admiral Michael Donovan, a man who had commanded strike groups and briefed presidents, and stood in rooms most people will never even hear about, came to a stop directly in front of me, squared his shoulders, and rendered a full formal salute. "Permission to recognize Ghost 4, sir," he said loud enough that every single person in that gallery heard it. I don't think I've ever seen a courtroom go that quiet that fast. Somewhere behind me I heard the young attorney's confident smile disappear without a sound. I heard the shuffle of people leaning forward in their seats, trying to understand what they were looking at. A decorated 4-star Admiral standing at attention in front of a woman he'd just been told to strip of her jacket, addressing her with more formality than he'd shown the judge himself. Judge Hawthorne's gavel was still in his hand, resting on the bench, forgotten. His face had gone through several expressions in the span of about 4 seconds. Irritation, confusion, something close to alarm. And he opened his mouth to reassert control over his own courtroom the way judges are trained to do. "Admiral, I don't know what—" "Your Honor," Donovan said, not unkindly, but with an authority that made even Hawthorne pause mid-sentence. "With respect, I'd ask you to give me 60 seconds before this proceeds any further." I stood there, my hand still resting slightly against the worn seam of my jacket, and I felt something I hadn't let myself feel in a very long time. Not pride, exactly. Something closer to grief that had aged into something quieter. Because I knew what he was about to do, and I knew I couldn't stop him, and some part of me had spent 10 years hoping nobody would ever say that name out loud in a room full of strangers again. The judge, to his credit, or maybe just out of stunned curiosity, nodded once. Donovan turned to face the gallery, and for a moment his eyes swept across the rows of unfamiliar faces. The reporters with their notepads, the businessman's attorney sitting rigid at his table, the businessman himself in the front row wearing an expression I couldn't quite read yet, but would understand very clearly before the day was over. 10 years ago. Donovan began, and his voice had changed, had dropped into something lower and more deliberate, the voice of a man who had given difficult briefings before, and knew exactly how to hold a room. I commanded a joint task force operating in a location I'm not at liberty to name in this setting. During that operation, one of my SEAL teams was ambushed in terrain that made extraction impossible for nearly 8 hours. He paused. I watched him swallow, watched something move behind his eyes that told me he was back there too in whatever room in his memory held that day. 4 of my men were wounded critically. We lost radio contact with our medevac. And a combat medic, one woman alone unarmed except for her kit, moved into that kill zone under fire and refused to leave it. The gallery had gone completely still. I could feel every eye in that room shift toward me, and I kept my gaze fixed somewhere just past Judge Hawthorne's shoulder, because I wasn't ready yet to watch strangers look at me the way I knew they were about to. She held those 4 men alive for almost 8 hours, Donovan continued. She was burned. She took shrapnel to her side. Her arm was broken in 2 places, and she kept working anyway because she'd decided that leaving wasn't an option she was willing to consider. He looked at me, then just briefly, something soft passing across his face that no one else in that room would have recognized for what it was, the look of a commander who had spent 10 years carrying the weight of what he owed someone he'd never properly been allowed to thank. Her call sign, he said, turning back to the judge, was Ghost 4. Judge Hawthorne's face had gone pale in a way I hadn't seen on him before, and I watched his eyes drop just briefly to the jacket he'd ordered me to remove not 5 minutes earlier. No one in that courtroom moved for what felt like a long time, though I know now it was probably only a few seconds. Judge Hawthorne set his gavel down slowly, the way a man sets down something he's suddenly afraid might break, and I remember thinking almost distantly that this was the first moment since I'd walked into that room that anyone had looked at me and actually seen something, instead of a jacket that didn't match the dress code. Admiral Donovan wasn't finished. I could tell by the way he squared himself again, the way his jaw tightened, that there was more he needed to say, and that he'd been carrying it for a long time without anywhere to put it down. Your Honor, he said, I'd like the record to reflect exactly what happened that day, because I don't believe this woman has ever told anyone the full account, and I don't believe she ever will unless someone else says it first. He turned toward the gallery again, and this time his voice carried the particular weight of someone recounting something he had reviewed in his own memory, 1,000 times the way you turn over a stone in your pocket until its edges go smooth. We had inserted a 4-man element to gather intelligence ahead of a larger operation. The insertion went wrong almost immediately. Enemy forces were waiting in positions we hadn't accounted for, and within the first 90 seconds of contact, we had 2 men down with gunshot wounds, and a third with a traumatic leg injury from an IED blast that also took out our lead vehicle. Our 4th man was providing suppressing fire alone, pinned behind what little cover existed. I felt my own breathing slow the way it used to slow whenever I had to keep my hands from shaking, an old discipline coming back to me even now 10 years, and a courtroom away from that ridge line. I remembered the heat first, always the heat, thick and suffocating, the kind that made the air itself feel like something you had to fight through rather than breathe. Air support was 40 minutes out, Donovan continued, and that was the optimistic estimate. Our combat controller couldn't raise anyone on comms for the first 20 of those minutes because our radio operator was one of the wounded. We had no extraction, no reliable air cover, and 4 men who were not going to survive without immediate medical intervention. He looked at me again briefly, and something in his expression asked permission, though he didn't wait for it before continuing. Major Bennetson was attached to our element as a forward medic, which at that time was an unusual assignment for someone with her specific training, but she'd requested it herself against the advice of people who told her the risk profile was higher than what her role typically required. When contact began, she didn't wait for orders. She moved from our position at the rear of the column directly into the kill zone under active fire, carrying only her aid bag and whatever she could fit into her vest. I heard someone in the gallery draw in a sharp breath. I didn't look to see who. She reached the first wounded man within 90 seconds and began treating a gunshot wound to his abdomen, while rounds were still impacting the ground around her. She moved to the second man, stabilized a leg injury that by every account should have caused him to bleed out within minutes, and somehow kept him alive for the better part of 8 hours, using nothing but a tourniquet packing material and sheer force of will. She then reached our suppressing element, treated a shrapnel wound to his shoulder, while he continued returning fire, and finally reached our fourth man, who had taken a round to the chest that by every rule of battlefield medicine should have been fatal within minutes, without immediate surgical intervention which was not available to us. Nachin said. The businessmen at the front of the courtroom had gone very still. I noticed it even through everything else happening the way you notice a change in weather before you fully register the storm. His attorney had stopped writing on his legal pad entirely. She kept all 4 of those men alive, Donovan said, for nearly 8 hours in 115-degree heat under intermittent enemy fire while sustaining injuries of her own, that she did not disclose to anyone at the time. Second-degree burns along her right forearm from an explosion close enough to ignite part of her uniform. A fractured radius and ulna from being thrown against rock during a secondary blast. Shrapnel wounds to her lower back that she treated herself in the dark, using a mirror and her own hands because she refused to divert attention from the men she was keeping alive. I felt the weight of every eye in that room settle on me now, and I made myself stand still, made myself keep my chin level, because that had always been easier than looking directly at what people saw when they finally understood. When extraction finally arrived, Donovan said all 4 men were alive. All 4 of them came home to their families. I have stood at the wedding of one of those men. I have watched another one coach his daughter's soccer team. I have received a phone call from a third man's mother, thanking me for bringing her son home, not knowing that the person she should have been thanking was standing 11 feet from where the ambush occurred, holding her son's chest wound closed with her bare hands. His voice caught just slightly on that last part, and I understood then that this was not easy for him either, that he had been holding this story the way you hold something you're afraid will shatter if you set it down wrong. After the operation, he continued, full recognition was prepared for her. A silver star at minimum given the circumstances. She declined it. She requested that her name be kept out of any official record beyond what was operationally necessary, and because of the classified nature of the mission that request was honored. She has never spoken publicly about what happened that day. As far as I was aware until about 4 minutes ago, she never intended to. He turned fully to face Judge Hawthorne now, and his voice hardened into something with an edge I hadn't heard from him yet. Every man in my command who walked off that ridge alive owes his life to the woman you just ordered to remove her jacket, Your Honor. I'd ask the court to consider that before proceeding. Judge Hawthorne said nothing for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost every trace of the authority it carried when this hearing began. Judge Hawthorne cleared his throat twice before any sound came out, and when it finally did, it was smaller than anything he'd said all morning. Major Bennetson. He said, You may keep the jacket on. I didn't say anything back. There wasn't anything that needed saying. I gave him a small nod, the kind you give someone when the moment has passed, and you're both trying to figure out how to move forward from it, and then I walked the rest of the way to the witness stand and took my seat. Admiral Donovan stepped back toward the gallery, but he didn't sit down. He stood near the front row with his hands folded behind him at something close to parade rest, and I understood without needing to look that he intended to stay for whatever came next. The bailiff swore me in. My hand was steady on the Bible, steadier than I expected given everything that had just happened, and I think that steadiness came from the same place. It always comes from the part of me that learned a long time ago how to separate what I'm feeling from what I need to do. I had a job in that room, and it wasn't to be the woman Admiral Donovan had just described. It was to tell the truth about what I'd found in Ethan Brooks's case, and I intended to do exactly that. The businessman's attorney rose first, and I could see immediately that whatever confidence he'd walked in with had thinned considerably in the last 10 minutes. He asked his questions carefully, almost gently, in the manner of a man trying not to disturb something he now understood might bite back. I answered him plainly, no embellishment, No emotion. Just what I had reviewed, what I had found, and what conclusions the evidence supported. Major Bennetson, he said, "You're not a forensic video analyst. What qualifies you to speak to alterations in security footage?" "I'm not a video analyst," I agreed. "But I spent 6 years reviewing combat footage for after-action reports where a half-second gap in a timeline could mean the difference between a soldier facing charges and a soldier being cleared of wrongdoing. I know what a clean edit looks like versus what a natural recording looks like. I'd be happy to walk the court through exactly what I found frame by frame if that would help." He didn't take me up on that offer. I hadn't expected him to. When it came time for me to lay out what I'd actually found, I did it the way I would present findings to a commanding officer, plainly without drama, letting the facts carry whatever weight they needed to carry on their own. I explained that the store's security footage, the version submitted as evidence, had a gap of exactly 14 seconds, at precisely the moment Ethan Brooks made contact with the shooter. A gap that didn't appear in any of the footage before or after it, and that the file's metadata showed it had been re-exported and saved 3 days after the original recording date using software typically used for video editing rather than simple file transfer. I explained that the timeline submitted in the police report placed Ethan near a shelving display that, according to the store's own inventory records, had been damaged and reported to insurance a full 2 days before the shooting occurred, meaning the damage the lawsuit attributed to his actions couldn't possibly have been caused by him. I explained that Ethan's own medical records, which I had pulled with his consent, showed a laceration on his left hand, consistent with breaking a store window from the inside, which matched his account of creating a secondary exit for the girl he was protecting rather than causing property destruction recklessly, as the complaint alleged. And then I laid out the last piece, the one I'd found only 2 nights earlier working past midnight in an empty office at Walter Reed, because I couldn't sleep anyway, and figured I might as well use the hours for something useful. A radio transcript from the responding officer's dispatch log, time-stamped and unedited, in which one of the first officers on scene could be heard describing Ethan's actions in real time as a civilian pulling a kid to safety, a description that never made it into the official written report filed later that same day. "Someone changed the story after the fact," I said. "The footage was cut, the timeline was rewritten, and the original words of the officer who was actually there were left out of the final report entirely." I watched the courtroom take that in. I watched the businessman in the front row shift in his seat, his eyes moving toward the exit before his attorney's hand landed briefly on his arm, a silent instruction to stay still. I watched 2 people in suits near the back of the gallery, people I hadn't noticed before, begin whispering urgently to each other, and something in the set of their shoulders told me they weren't there as spectators. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward, his earlier bluster completely gone, now replaced by something that looked almost like dread. "Major Bennetson, are you telling this court that evidence was deliberately falsified in this case?" "I'm telling this court what the evidence shows, Your Honor," I said. "I'll let you draw your own conclusions about intent. But I don't believe 14 seconds disappears from a security recording by accident. And I don't believe an officer's own words get left out of his own report unless someone decided those words were inconvenient." The businessman stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor, loud enough to make several people jump. "This is outrageous," he said. "This woman has no standing to—" "Sit down," Judge Hawthorne said, and there was nothing uncertain in his voice this time. It was the voice of a man who had just realized exactly how close he'd come to letting something terrible happen in his own courtroom, and who was not going to let it happen now. "Sit down, sir, before I have you removed." The businessman sat. His face had gone the color of ash, and for the first time since I'd walked into that room, I felt something shift in the air that told me the truth finally was starting to win. The prosecutor requested a recess almost immediately after that, and Judge Hawthorne granted it without hesitation, which told me more about how seriously he was now taking this than anything he could have said out loud. I sat in a small witness room down the hall for the better part of 2 hours, drinking bad courthouse coffee out of a paper cup, while investigators went to work on everything I'd laid out on the record. I found out most of what happened during that recess the same way everyone else eventually did, through the county investigator who came to update me, a tired-looking woman named Detective Ruiz, who'd clearly been doing this job long enough to have stopped being surprised by anything people were willing to do to protect their money. The security footage once pulled directly from the store's original server, rather than the copy submitted as evidence, showed exactly what I'd said it would. 14 seconds untouched, showing Ethan breaking through a side window with his bare hands to create an exit route for the girl, moving her out of the direct line of fire while the shooter was reloading. No property recklessly destroyed for no reason. A calculated, split-second decision made by a man who had spent 2 tours in Afghanistan, learning exactly how many seconds a person has before a bad situation becomes an unrecoverable one. The officer whose original radio transcript I'd quoted, it turned out, hadn't left those words out of his report by accident. Detective Ruiz told me carefully, in the measured way people talk when they're still deciding how much they're allowed to share, that a second officer, one closer to retirement, and with financial troubles that had apparently made him receptive to certain conversations, had been the one to file the final written report. And that report had been reviewed and adjusted twice before submission, each time in ways that happened to align with the businessman's version of events. There was money involved. There's almost always money involved. The businessman, whose name I'd learn later was Gerald Whitfield, owned the shopping plaza where the store was located, and it turned out he'd been in the middle of a very lucrative deal to sell the property to a developer. A deal that was contingent on the plaza maintaining a clean safety record with no active liability claims. A lawsuit blaming a bystander for the property damage, rather than acknowledging that an active shooter had torn through his plaza and terrified his tenants, was cleaner for his numbers. Ethan Brooks was simply the most convenient person to blame, a decorated Marine with no money for a real legal defense, and as far as Whitfield's people had assumed, no one in his corner willing to fight back. They hadn't accounted for me being in that corner, and they certainly hadn't accounted for an Admiral walking into a courtroom at exactly the wrong moment for their plan, and exactly the right moment for the truth. By the time the recess ended and everyone filed back into the courtroom, the air in that room had changed entirely from where it had started. Nobody was whispering about my jacket anymore. Nobody was looking at me like I was some inconvenient woman who didn't understand courtroom etiquette. I could feel eyes on me still, but it was a different kind of attention now, the kind that comes with actual respect rather than assumption. Judge Hawthorne took his seat at the bench, and for a long moment he simply sat there looking down at his own hands folded in front of him. And I watched something happen in his face that I recognized because I'd seen it before, in commanding officers who'd made the wrong call under pressure and had to live with the consequences of it in front of the very people they'd wronged. Major Bennetson. He said finally, and his voice had none of the sharp edges it carried at the start of this hearing, "I owe you an apology, and I intend to give it properly in front of this entire courtroom, not because I'm required to, but because it's the right thing to do." I hadn't expected that. I want to be honest about that. I'd expected at best a quiet dismissal of the earlier moment, the kind of thing powerful people do when they want an incident to simply stop existing without ever actually acknowledging it happened. I hadn't expected a judge, a man who'd built 30 years of career on projecting unshakable authority, to sit in front of a full gallery and admit he'd been wrong. "When you walked into my courtroom this morning," he continued, "I made a judgment about you based on a torn jacket and an appearance that didn't match what I expected from a witness in a case this serious. I was wrong to demand you remove it, and I was wrong for the reasons behind that demand, which had nothing to do with courtroom decorum and everything to do with an assumption I should never have made. If I had succeeded in what I asked of you, if you had walked out of this courtroom rather than stay, I believe an innocent man would very likely be facing consequences he did not deserve, based on evidence that was deliberately falsified. That is not a small thing, and I will not treat it as one. Mein daden noise." He looked at me directly then, and there was something almost pleading in his expression, though he didn't say so outright. "I hope you'll accept my apology, Major, not because you owe me that grace, but because I'd like the record of this courtroom to show that I recognize the mistake I made here today. I thought about several things I could have said. I thought about telling him it was fine, the easy thing people say to smooth over a moment and move everyone past their discomfort. But it wasn't entirely fine, and I've never been someone who pretends otherwise just to make a room more comfortable. I accept your apology, Your Honor," I said instead. "I'd only ask that you remember this the next time someone walks into your courtroom who doesn't look the way you expect them to. Not everyone gets an Admiral to speak up for them." He held my gaze for a long moment and then he nodded slowly, like a man committing something to memory he intended to keep. The rest of that day moved quickly the way things tend to once the truth finally gets loose in a room and nobody can stuff it back where it came from. Judge Hawthorne didn't wait for a jury deliberation that everyone in that courtroom now understood would be a formality. Given the evidence, the falsified footage, the doctored report, the financial motive Detective Ruiz had already begun laying out for the record, he dismissed the case against Ethan Brooks that same afternoon on the record, in front of everyone who'd come to watch a very different story play out. This court finds no basis for these charges, Judge Hawthorne said, and further finds credible evidence of evidence tampering and witness intimidation sufficient to warrant a full criminal referral. He looked directly at Gerald Whitfield as he said it, and Whitfield, who'd spent the entire recess whispering urgently with his attorney, had nothing left to whisper about now. Mr. Whitfield, you are hereby remanded for further investigation into obstruction of justice and witness tampering. Bailiff, please take him into custody. I watched 2 federal agents, the same pair I'd noticed whispering in the back of the gallery earlier that morning, step forward before the local bailiff even reached him. It turned out the FBI had already been building a quiet case against Whitfield for something entirely separate, a pattern of financial fraud tied to several of his other properties, and my testimony that morning had simply handed them the final piece they needed to move immediately, rather than wait months longer. They walked him out of that courtroom in handcuffs past rows of people who'd arrived that morning expecting to watch a decorated Marine get buried under a rich man's lawsuit. The officer who'd falsified his report was suspended within the week pending his own criminal investigation, and 2 other officers connected to the case were placed on administrative leave, while a broader review examined how deep the corruption actually ran. I heard later that the review turned up at least 2 other cases where evidence had been quietly altered in Whitfield's favor over the years. Cases that were now being reopened by people whose names I never learned, working in offices I'll never see doing the slow, unglamorous work of putting things right. Ethan Brooks cried when the judge dismissed the charges. I don't think he was embarrassed by it, and I certainly wasn't going to make him feel that he should be. I've seen enough grown men cry in far worse circumstances to know it's not a weakness, it's just what happens when the weight you've been carrying finally gets set down. He came over to me afterward in the hallway outside the courtroom and he didn't say much. He just shook my hand, held it a beat longer than a normal handshake, and said, "I don't know how to thank you for this." "You already did what mattered," I told him. "You went toward that girl instead of away from her. That's the only thing that ever needed thanking." Admiral Donovan found me a little while later once the crowd outside the courthouse had mostly thinned the reporters chasing after Whitfield's departing car for a quote nobody was going to get. He was holding something small in his hand, and when he reached me, he held it out without much ceremony, the way men who've spent decades in uniform tend to hand over things that matter most to them, like it's nothing, like it's just a small object rather than something carrying the weight of a decade. It was a challenge coin, old, the edges worn smooth from years of being carried in someone's pocket. On one side, an insignia I recognized instantly. On the other, 4 small stars arranged around a single word I hadn't seen written down in 10 years. "I've carried this since that day," he said. "I always thought I'd get the chance to give it to you properly at some kind of ceremony, something with a little more dignity than a courthouse hallway. I didn't expect it to happen like this. But I don't think I'll get a better opportunity, and I don't think you'd have wanted the ceremony anyway." He wasn't wrong about that. I took the coin from his hand, feeling the worn metal against my palm, and for a moment I couldn't say anything at all. "You never asked anyone to remember Ghost 4? He said quietly. "But America should. Those 4 men have children now, Major. Children who exist because you refused to leave that position. I don't think there's a coin heavy enough to account for that, but it's what I have and I wanted you to have it." I thanked him the only way that felt honest, which was simply without trying to dress it up into something bigger than it was. Some things don't need more words wrapped around them. They just need to be received. A reporter caught up with me on the courthouse steps a few minutes later, notebook already out, clearly having pieced together enough of the story from people in the gallery to know there was something here worth asking about. She asked a few questions I answered plainly the same way I'd answered everything that day, and then she asked the one question I think she'd been building toward the whole time. "Major Bennetson, why do you still wear that jacket? After everything it's clearly been through, most people would have replaced it years ago." I looked down at the scorched sleeve, the shoulder seams stitched back together more times than I could count, the small, faded patch that had just spent an entire morning being seen by more people than had seen it in the last 10 years combined. Because 4 men came home wearing theirs, I said. She didn't ask anything else after that. I don't think there was anything else that needed asking. If you've made it this far with me, I genuinely love to know what stayed with you. Was it the jacket, the Admiral's salute? The moment the judge finally understood what he'd almost done. Tell me in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I read every single one. We share stories like this because we believe the truth is always worth telling, no matter how long it takes to come out, and we've got so many more waiting for you. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Let's keep walking this road together.